Hi, everyone. Welcome to Social Media Management in Science Communication. I'm Ki-Youn Kim, a science communication specialist, and this workshop was created in collaboration with the Royal Canadian Institute of Science, which I will refer to as RCI Science throughout the workshop. RCI Science is a nonprofit and a registered charity that is focused on public engagement with Canadian scientists. And their aim is to foster critical thinking, expand science dialogue, and promote informed decision making with their award winning program. A little bit about me. I do a wide range of work in science communication, and social media is one of those streams. I have around 4 years of experience managing organizational accounts in the health, research, and STEM sector. I also taught social media for a semester at the Laurentian University Graduate Program of Science Communication. So I'd like to sincerely thank you for joining me today to learn something about social media. And if you're already quite experienced, I hope you can still gain something. So this workshop is part of a series on social media communications, and it was created with the support from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Pacific Institute on Pathogens, Pandemics, and Society, and the BCCDC Foundation for Public Health.
Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsi, Kwikwetlam, Kakite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples on whose unceded traditional territories our three campuses reside.
I also strongly encourage you to look deeper into the unceded traditional territory that you reside on, and you can easily do that using www.nativeland.ca. I was taught that for presentations, it's always important to provide spoilers at the very beginning so that people know what to expect. It's the only time where spoilers are acceptable, in my opinion. So for today, we'll be covering an overview of social media usage in Canada, followed by a summary of the four main platforms that scientific and health organizations tend to be primarily on. Then I'll go into social media strategy and management. And of course, we can't leave out content creation. And lastly, we'll finish off with social media analytics. I know that sitting for 60 minutes plus straight in an information-dense workshop can be quite overwhelming, so I've built in little pause breaks between each section in case you need a bio break or just a break from staring at an online workshop. And before I start, I want to preface this with the fact that as organizations, we need to approach social media differently than as individuals or influencers would. So this workshop was specifically tailored to kind of reflect that. And there is a lot of content, and typically I would teach this over an entire semester course, but I've done my best to kind of pick the highlights for a 1 hour workshop. Now, by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to understand social media usage in Canada, how to choose the right social media platform for your focus audience, plan and execute a social media campaign, create content based on best practices, and measure the success of your campaign. Again, I know I'll be covering a lot, but I hope the emojis, pretty pictures, and the colors will help you pay attention. Before we go straight into social media management, I wanted to spend a couple minutes to show you the overall trends in social media usage and behaviors in Canada. I'll be taking you through the We Are Social and Hootsuite annual analysis of global social media trends. They publish one every year, and it's always a really interesting read. A lot of people hold the conception that social media is a younger generation thing, but roughly 87.1% of the Canadian population are social media users. That's almost 9 out of 10 people. And roughly 93.6% of Canadians own a smartphone. On average, Canadians spend around 6 hours and 45 minutes on the internet and about 2 hours on social media. There's a wide range of reasons for why people may use social media, and the top reason being keeping in touch with friends and family. The most likely reason why people will follow your account may be to find the latest updates from your organization, especially if you're an authority on health, or to find relevant content that your organization produces because they have a vested interest in what you do. Here's a breakdown of the list of the social media platforms that the Canadian population tends to use each month. If we look at the top 4, or the main 4 that we'll be focusing on today, Facebook takes the lead, followed by Instagram, Twitter, and then LinkedIn. This pretty accurately reflects how the general public tends to use social media. And as the audience becomes more niche, or the purpose of that platform becomes more focused, the percentage of user decreases. So for example, LinkedIn is very reflective of people who are still in their careers, so kind of like the middle of the population in terms of the age group. And for those who are curious about TikTok, it ranks just above LinkedIn. Every couple of years, the social media lab from Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson University, publishes a census survey about social media adoption and use in Canada. I highly recommend checking it out. Despite what people think about Facebook dying, there is actually still a lot of daily users, and it kind of dwindles off as we go down the list of different platforms that people tend to use. But the majority of adult Canadians are on social media on a daily or weekly basis. And if we were to break that down on the percentage of adult Canadians on social media, 80% have a Facebook account, 51% have an Instagram account, 40% have a Twitter account, 37% have a LinkedIn account, and around 26% have a TikTok account. One thing I want to preface here is that your main audience may not necessarily be on all the platforms. It's important to identify which platform your community and audiences tend to use than to try to be on every single platform. So, for example, if you're a public health unit, you may find more success on Facebook and Instagram than the other platforms. If you're a science outreach organization and you need to reach a younger audience or a demographic, TikTok may be worth trying. Lastly, I wanted to summarize the 3 social media trends for 2023. First, experts have noted that there has been a tremendous growth in social media users and usage during the pandemic. But they've also predicted that the overall growth will now slow as people return to a somewhat more normal lifestyle and they're able to go outside and live their lives again. Second, people won't be spending more of their offline activity time to do online stuff. So right now, brands and organizations will have to create competitive, valuable content to gain a user's attention during their online time. Lastly, more and more people will spend more time on TikTok than any other platform. Again, this doesn't mean that TikTok is the right platform for you, especially if you're research-oriented and have limited resources. You typically need a full-time employee just for TikTok alone, or a team that's willing to plan and rotate creating content throughout the month. So that brings us to our first break. So for those who aren't going to be taking a break, I'm going to be continuing on. And before we kind of dive into like the meat of the workshop, I want to add that social media is constantly changing. And there is a good chance that a lot of the information I'm sharing today will be outdated in about like 6 to 12 months. It really depends on the platform. It could be minor changes, it could be major changes. When I was teaching Twitter or X at the start of this year, I found that every time I taught something, by the next week, it was outdated just because Elon Musk kept changing the platform and how it functioned, and he kept laying people off. Now, it's not going to be that bad for the platforms on a regular basis, but it is still important to stay up to date with platform and algorithm changes at least once or twice a year. You just look up change 2023 changes for XYZ platform or algorithm changes, and it kind of gives you a rough idea how they might have like shifted things around. So for today, I'm going to be focusing on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And the reason why I'm not focusing on TikTok is that many of the scientific and health organizations aren't on TikTok yet. And as my one avid friend, one TikTok, I have a friend who's a very avid user for TikTok, and she said the teens will bully you off the platform when I asked about it. Um, but jokes aside, I found that the demographic that many organizations that I work with are not necessarily on TikTok. First up, Twitter or X. I noticed they've changed their logo, but their address is still Twitter. If I were to summarize Twitter into three words, it would be it's text heavy, very focused on real-time updates, and there's a lot of public discourse. So it allows a lot of people to have those conversations. If you are on the homepage of Twitter, you'll find that there is a trending topics on the right-hand side of the main page, and it kind of shows you what are the things people are talking about right now. Typically, Twitter allows text posts or tweets that have a 280 character limit. I know that if you have Twitter Blue, you get that little check mark and it allows you to have more than 280 characters. I think it's 4,000. But when people are scrolling through their main feed, they won't see the entirety of your post. If you did draft something that was longer than 280 characters, they'll see a C more afterwards the 280 mark. And that can often act as another barrier for people to have to open and go to your page and tweet, which most people I find are reluctant to do that unless if they're super invested in it. Tweets can include images, videos, or GIFs. I understand it's actually technically pronounced GIFs. Threading has become a workaround for the character limit, though. And for those who aren't familiar with what threading is, it's where you connect multiple tweets together to create a long form content on Twitter. And some communities have started to create something called tweetorials by using threading. I found that individuals will have a lot of success with threads, but organizational accounts usually don't have the highest engagement when they do threading, unless if you're a very popular account where your users are used to seeing your threads and they want to read what you have to say. I know Ottawa Public Health usually is quite successful in that regard. When it comes to tweets, users can engage with the tweet with replies, retweets, and likes, and the average half-life of a tweet is less than 30 minutes. I found that there was not quite wide, but it was around like 18 minutes to 22 minutes. But to keep things simple and to help you remember things a bit better, I said less than 30 minutes. And for those who are like, what does that mean? It means that half of the impressions and engagements that you'll get on that specific tweet will happen in 30 minutes. And after that, it'll kind of dwindle off. Now, these aren't hard set rules. These are just guidelines because I've definitely had tweets that continue to have a lot of great momentum past the 24-hour mark. This brings us to Instagram. And if I were to summarize Instagram, I would say it's very visual, very branding focused, and has a lot of influencers on it. For Instagram, posts can be of single or multiple images or videos. So, like I mentioned, Instagram is a very visual platform. It can be quite time consuming when it comes to designing and creating kind of an authentic account. Instagram is the only social media platform out of these four where you cannot add in a link within the captions, which is very clever on Instagram's part because they make the user stay on their platforms and it's really hard to drive external traffic. So one workaround for that was something called link in bio. There's a lot of different softwares that you can use or there's different like companies that provide this link in bio option, but people in the captions will say, oh, if you want to find out more about this event or XYZ, check out the link in bio, which is a link in the profile that is connected to your account. And that's where people will be able to kind of leave Instagram to check something out. For Instagram posts, users can like, comment, send, and bookmark a post. You'll notice that across the different platforms, they have very similar user engagement features, but they might be called something slightly different. So for Twitter, it was called replies, but on Instagram, it's called comments. And the average half-life of a post is around under 24 hours. This brings us to the third one, Facebook. The best way I would describe Facebook is that it's very multimedia, community focused, and it has quite a global reach compared to the other ones. Posts typically have text with a single or multiple images. Lately, video posts are quite popular as well, but there are a lot of other different posts that kind of extend beyond those two. If an individual is using it, I've noticed that people will also share kind of status updates about how they're doing as well. And none of the other platforms have been nearly as successful as Facebook when it comes to kind of that personal connection through like friends and also being part of a community with common interests. So they have something called groups. And I think the reason why Facebook has like still been around is because of those features that they have a fairly strong hold on a lot of the user base, as well as I found that the global reach of Facebook is quite extensive. Like a lot of people globally around the world use Facebook. For posts, users can like, comment, and share posts, and the average half-life of a post is just under 2 hours. So for our last platform, I'd say LinkedIn is very text oriented. You will see images and videos, but I'll talk about that in a second. It's very much a professional user base and it's very business focused. So posts typically have text with a single image. Companies tend to post videos more than individuals, especially if they have the capacity for it. Video creation and video production can be quite expensive and time consuming. So it's not something that everyone does, but the companies that have the budget for it or the capacity for it, I've noticed they've done that more. LinkedIn is primarily used for networking and career advancement. So you might be wondering, okay, Ki-Youn, well then why is LinkedIn even useful for people who are in the SciComm space? Well, I'd say it's great. It's a great platform to connect with your professional audience, sponsors, and partners. So I've noticed for organizations that tend to organize a lot of events and conferences, you're doing a lot of sponsorships, shout outs through LinkedIn. And in terms of posts, users can like, comment, and repost and send a post. And the average half-life of a post is around 24 hours. This specifically is only meant to be a guideline, and the audiences of your organization may not always be reflected on what I have on this slide. This is just meant to be kind of like general trends of audiences that myself and my professional colleagues have noticed. Usually, researchers, academics, and grad students are quite active on Twitter and to a lesser degree on Instagram. Some of them may also be on LinkedIn, but I've noticed you'll have the highest engagement on Twitter, usually with this crowd, especially for English speakers. You'll also find a lot of science communicators on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, which makes sense considering they're often sharing and doing outreach. I found that many of working professionals in STEM and SciComm are also concentrated on Twitter and LinkedIn. If they're not on one, you'll usually find them on the other. For reaching the general audience, you'll find that Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook tends to cover a lot of the demographics together, especially Facebook. The user base of Facebook is the most representative of the population in terms of age out of all the 4 platforms here. But that doesn't necessarily reflect user activity. Lately, Facebook has become more and more popular with the older age groups. So if older adults is something that you're trying to target, that's where I would recommend starting. Now, depending on the organization, they may be all on all 4 platforms, or they may be only on a couple of the platforms. It'll really depend on what the organization is about and their goals. So, for example, a scientific society membership association would be more active on Twitter and LinkedIn compared to an outreach organization that would be more active on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Academic institutions tend to be on all major platforms, but I've noticed even if they're on Facebook, they're not as intensely active as they are on Twitter, Instagram, and to a lesser degree on LinkedIn. It really depends on the institution's goals and purposes of using that social media account. I also know that quite a few institutions have joined TikTok and they use that as a way to recruit students, and some have found a lot of great success. Lastly, companies can be found across all platforms, but some may stick with one or more than the other. Some may only stick with the ones that are most relevant to them. So just because they're present on all the platforms doesn't necessarily mean they'll be the most active, or some companies will just pick the platforms that are most relevant to them. So if I were to really summarize the purpose of the slide one more time for you, is to not only give you an overview of where your audience may be, but to also remind you that you'll have to look at your organization's accounts and analytics to really hone your understanding of your follower audience. This is meant to be more of a basic stepping stone for those who aren't sure how to start. Again, these aren't hard set rules. And one last reminder here is that it's going to look really enticing to try to be on every single platform. But I want to emphasize that not everyone is going to be on every single platform. Your primary audience and community may be very much focused or concentrated in like Twitter, for example, or LinkedIn, or Facebook, or Instagram. So while I know that a lot of us feel like we need to be out there on everything, it's really important to choose the right platforms to invest in because social media is a very time-consuming effort. That brings us to our second break. So if you need a break or you haven't taken a break yet, feel free to pause right here. Okay, if you've taken a break, welcome back. If you've stuck around, hello again. We're going to be continuing on to social media strategy and management. Okay, social media can't be a standalone effort. It needs to be a part of your organization's communication plan. And this is because you have many different communications channels that you're maintaining, and social media should be only considered one of those channels. Therefore, in order for social media to be used as an effective tool by your organization, it still needs to be guided by the overarching communications goals. And realistically, for social media, you need a team of a couple people to comfortably manage several accounts. But I recognize that a lot of people are going to be going at this alone on top of a lot of their other communications responsibilities or event planning responsibilities or anything else that's out there. I really do empathize. I've been in that position. It's quite difficult. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to provide advice that applies to everyone because these best principles will be consistent whether you're one person or an entire team. Over time, you may end up developing your own guiding principles as you gain more experience while you're working in social media, but these are just mine to kind of help you get started. The first is be realistic. Managing social media is often about being realistic with what you can do because you will face limitations. That includes time, money, effort, resources, and maybe you don't have enough staff for it. As I said earlier, social media is just one channel to help you achieve your organizational goals. Social media is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And something I always remind my students of is that you need to aim for sustainability while you're working in this space. That being said, it's always important to prioritize quality over quantity. It's more important to produce high quality posts over low quality posts as long as you're consistent. So what I mean by that is that it's far better for you to post maybe once a week than to post like 10 posts in that week and then kind of go radio silent for like another 6 months. This way, when you're consistent and you're producing quality content, your followers know what to expect. They recognize your branding, they recognize what kind of posts that you tend to put out, and they know when to expect your content to be published. And lastly, be intentional. You really need to structure your strategy so everything has intention. Whether it's the overarching approach to your social media in general or a specific campaign, make sure that it aligns with the mission of the organization. Individual campaigns should have set goals so that you can later measure them as well. I have a little checklist for you for planning a social media campaign. So the first is define the objective of the social media campaign. Why are you running this campaign? What do you hope that it achieves? How does it fit into the overarching communications plan? Pick a measurable metric, whether that's clicks or impressions or profile visits. This will help you measure your success. So, for example, if you're trying to figure out how many people registered for an event or went to a web page that you're sharing, you'd want to look at link clicks. If you're looking at how much awareness you were able to drum up, then I would look at impressions. And if you're hoping to kind of get a better sense of brand awareness, profile visits, it's a usually pretty good indicator of people who are interested in your organization. Third, determine your focus audience and how to reach them. Which platforms should you be focusing on? You do not have to create a campaign for every single platform. And if you are, you really want to aim to tailor that for each platform if you can. Identify the key messages and materials that need to be produced. So what's the consistent language that needs to be used so that it's in alignment with the newsletters that you're putting out, the language on the web page as well. And if you need images designed, what do you need to provide your graphic designer so they can put that together? Set a budget. So not every single organization I know is going to be willing to put in some paid promotion. But if you are, how much are you going to spend? And in terms of content creation, maybe you're going to hire someone to create images or videos for your campaign as well. So those things are also important to consider. Set a timeline for your campaign and identify what the frequency of posts are going to be. When do you need this campaign by, and how long is it going to run for? That way you're able to kind of plan ahead and how you need to create your posts. And finally, you can launch your campaign once you have all those things in line. Well, after you create your campaign. Typically, I like to build my campaigns like this. I laid out like a table. I found that tables were far easier than spreadsheets because spreadsheets like Excel and Google Sheets tend to limit how you can include images and how you space things out. So if you want to hit enter, you have to hit Alt Enter, and the spacing is funny when you copy and paste it in things. So you'll see here, if I were to build a campaign that has something for every single platform, you'll notice in the left column, we have details kind of signifying what this post is about, when it should be scheduled for. And for each of the platforms, I have it slightly tailored a little differently. So if you are working on like a document like this, I find that it's a little easier to get feedback from your team, whether that's on Google Docs or just on Word docs. I usually assume that organizations are either on Google or they're on Office 365 where they can kind of share things through SharePoint or OverDrive. This, again, is not a hard set rule. If you decide, you know what, this format doesn't work for my team, totally okay. You can figure out what works best for you. This is just to kind of give you an example, an idea of what it can look like. Content creation is also quite demanding work, and it takes a lot of creative juices. It's also very exhausting to do it on the fly constantly. If people who have had to do this understand what I'm talking about. That's why a lot of professionals in this space have learned and strongly recommend that planning ahead as much as you can make a huge difference. Regardless, we will still need to do last minute posts because we can't avoid emergency announcements and such. But usually then, because you're not constantly playing catch up or you're not you're not trying to put out fires all the time, you'll have a little bit of time to do those instead of dropping everything. Ideally, having a calendar of your organization's events or campaign dates is a really good idea. And also, same thing with awareness days related to your organization. So, awareness days are things like, let's say you're a math kind of oriented outreach organization, then days like Pi Day might be something you want to include. This way, when you have a calendar like this, is to kind of overview of maybe not even like the entire year, but maybe even throughout like every quarter, there's no surprises and you can anticipate the ebbs and flows of the workflow for social media. Second thing is drafting content ahead of time, especially if you're a bilingual organization or require additional pairs of eyes to take a look at the content. When you're working in an industry where the language is quite sensitive and you really need to perfect it and you're working with a large team, then you need to kind of allot enough time so that there's time for people to review it. In terms of bilingual organizations, we have to account for the fact that translations can actually do take a couple days. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind when we are navigating content creation and prepping for campaigns. Next step is compile all the appropriate user handles and hashtags. You'll find that as you do more work in social media, you'll be taking you'll be taking the same handles a couple times. They're like, especially if they're your partners or your sponsors, it's much easier to kind of have a list of everything ahead of time so that you don't have to constantly go back to the platform, look it up, and then tag them and such. So it's nice to kind of have that list and have the hashtags prepared so that everyone's consistently using the right hashtag. But continuing on that note of surprise last minute posts that sometimes come up, let's take a closer look. So when you are creating a single post, a couple of things we want to ask is, why are you creating this post? How does it fit into your overall communications plan? What is the action you want people to take on it? Have you tagged the relevant accounts and used the right hashtags? Based on that checklist, let's look at a good example of a social media post that kind of covers all those bases. I have the questions right on the side, and if you want to take a moment and try to answer these questions, hit pause and take a look at the post, kind of think about it, reflect on it, figure out what you think the answers are, and then we'll kind of go from there. I'm going to hold off for about 5 seconds in case people need to pause. Okay, this is your last chance to pause if you want to try to attempt this activity, because I will be continuing on. Excellent. Okay. When we look at this post from RCI Science, why do we think that they created this post? Looking at this tweet, we can see that they're sharing news relevant to an award-winning event. So they won an award for Science is a Drag at Falling Walls. So they want to share and feature that. And then for how does it fit into your overall communication plan? So remember at the very start of the workshop, I mentioned that they do a lot of public engagement programming. This could be tied back into promoting the organization's programming and its success. Now, I haven't seen the communications plan, so these are kind of rough guesstimates. What is the action you want people to take on? So it's really important to have an action within the posts. Otherwise, your users and your followers aren't going to know what they're supposed to do with it. In this case, the action that RCI Science wants users and people who come across this post is to take a listen to the Quirks and Quirks episode, and they've provided the link to let people know, here's the link you can click, you can listen to it. That's the action. And in terms of tagging the relevant accounts and the hashtags, we can see that they have 3 hashtags here: the event hashtag, Science is a Drag; Pride, which is relevant to the event; and STEM, which again is relevant to the event. And lastly, they've also tagged CBC Quirks and Quirks, because hopefully when you're usually tagging other organizations, it's to kind of like signal, hey, this is like they were associated with this thing, and also to kind of ask them to also boost your post. In terms of posting frequencies, I took a look at the recommendations from different sources and I got a wide range of numbers. I've tried to average out the general consensus. And again, these are recommendations and not absolute rules. If these numbers are not achievable for you, then I really recommend finding what is most sustainable and works best for your organization. So for Twitter, the number of daily posts ranged from 1 to 20, but I found that the sweet spot that was suggested was around 5 tweets or less. I don't have an estimation for number of posts per week because tweets tend to have, like I mentioned, a shelf life of around half-life of around less than 30 minutes. So Twitter in that regard is quite forgiving in terms of volume of posting, but we do still need to be careful not to spam our followers. It's also the most ideal platform for sharing live updates about an event through something called live tweeting. And in those cases, if you're like at a conference and you're live tweeting all the sessions, you'll be easily tweeting hundreds of tweets. For Instagram, the number of daily posts that's recommended is 1 to 2 posts a day and 3 to 5 posts a week. For LinkedIn, it's recommended to post during 1 to 2 posts a day too, but I found that the morning and noon were often recommended by social media management softwares. You can post up to 5 times a day, but again, it'll really depend on how great your engagement is and who your audience is. Since the audience, again, is professionals, posts should be made only during the weekdays and not on the weekends. And that ends up coming out to around 5 posts per week. Lastly, for Facebook, the recommendation is 1 to 2 posts per day and around 5 to 10 posts per week. For posting times, you can use analytics to help you determine when your followers are most active from the platform analytics and for social media management software analytics. But I'm going to try to provide a bit more information. Now, I wish I had a set answer for this, but the best time to post is when your audience is online. And it's really hard to figure out and agree on a single standard best time to post on social media. It takes a bit of figuring out because it really depends on your audience's habits, industry, time zones, and the platform's algorithm. But for organizational accounts, they tend to consistently post during work hours. And unless there's a special event happening, you also won't be monitoring outside of the work hours. I found that because a lot of organizational accounts are most active during the work hours, the other organizations that may be your partners will also be engaging with you during those work hours as well. I've provided the blog post for the status brew where I've kind of pulled all these images from, so feel free to take a look at those. And again, these are just recommendations. You'll notice that for the times, it'll show you that it's either CST or EST. In the case that the audience that is listening in today, I know is predominantly based in BC, and your audience will be predominantly in BC. Therefore, I've kind of removed the time zones and the recommended times just so that you can focus on when it'll be most effective for when your audience is awake. So the best times to post on Twitter are between Tuesdays to Thursdays, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. The worst times to post on Twitter is anytime before before 9 a.m. on Monday and anytime past 2 p.m. on Fridays. You'll notice that for a lot of the platforms, Friday afternoons just aren't a great time, and weekends are not the best times to post either. In terms of Instagram, best times to post are on weekdays, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Worst times to post on Instagram are super early in the morning and super late in the evenings, and the weekends are also not fantastic, but we do see there is a little blip here in Saturday after, like early morning or late morning, early afternoon-ish, where people are a little more active. For Facebook, Best times to post are weekdays 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. And the worst times to post on Facebook are super early in the morning and late in the evenings. And again, the weekends are not the most popular times to post. And for LinkedIn, best times to post are Tuesday to Thursdays, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Worst times to post are Monday morning, Friday past 1 p.m., and on the weekends. I found for LinkedIn, the best times to post will be around 9 a.m., followed by around 12 to 2 p.m., depending if it's the middle of the week. So those are like the two sweet spots where you're posting twice a day throughout the week on those like weekdays. And that kind of brings us to social media management softwares. Now, there's a huge range of social media management softwares that are available on the market in terms of features and price tags. Keep that in mind that nonprofits can receive reduced prices. I'm not going to be providing recommendations because depending on your organization's budgets and needs, the answer will be different. And also, there's a good chance a lot of those numbers and recommendations will be outdated in a couple months. However, I can cover the pros and cons of using social media management software. I'll go through the pros first. You can schedule content ahead of time, so you don't have to worry about having to be on the platform and posting it, which is really nice. You can schedule and kind of forget it. Some of the platforms do have the options to natively schedule within it, but I found that hasn't been very consistent across the board. Another benefit is that all accounts are streamlined on one place. So everything you want to see is in one place. And the last pro is that it can capture certain analytics that the social media platform natively won't capture, such as highest time of engagement. Now, just because it captures certain analytics doesn't mean it's going to be the most accurate. I've noticed there were some discrepancies when I ran campaigns and I was comparing the analytics. So when it comes to the actual analytics and reports I do, I still take a close look at what the actual numbers are like within the platform, whether that's Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or LinkedIn. There are a couple cons to social media management softwares, though. And the first is that you can't schedule certain types of posts, such as tweet threads, except on Buffer, tagging images, and tagging individuals. So you'll have to do that within the platform if you absolutely need to tag individuals. Depending on the platform, that might not work. I also know for certain softwares, you can't schedule carousels. That's what those multiple image Instagram posts are. So you would have to do that within Instagram. The second is that any form of engagement and reshares needs to be done within the platform. So you can't do it through the software. And the last con is that it can be quite costly. Not all of them are expensive, but the more advanced options become, it can come with a higher price tag. Overall, I know most organizations will work with a social media management software just because it is very time consuming to kind of do everything by hand when it comes to scheduling campaigns. And I wanted to talk a little bit about ad spend because this is something I've noticed that a lot of organizations are a little kind of nervous about, but they would really benefit from it. Different social media platforms will have different campaign objectives for ad spend as well, like paid promotions. But here I'm going to be focusing on impressions and link clicks, just because these two were the ones that I've ended up working with the most over time. And what I found was that if you want to run an awareness campaign, an awareness over oriented campaign, you would be focusing on doing a impression-based campaign. Whereas if you're trying to drive traffic to something or have someone do an action, I usually stick with a link click campaign where you're paying per click. At the very bottom of the slide, you'll see that the 4 different platforms are kind of arranged in a greater than kind of row. And the reason why I did that was to kind of show you which platforms are the most expensive, which are the cheapest. So Facebook tends to be the most affordable. You get your most bang for your buck, whereas LinkedIn can be quite pricey when it comes to advertising. I've noticed that if you check out different blogs, they say that Instagram and Twitter can also be switched in this row, but for the sector that we're in, I've noticed that hasn't been the case. If you were to demand from me to give you numbers, because I know people usually want numbers on how much things cost. There is a really wide range of things, so I kind of did my best to kind of give an average. Typically, it costs $7 to $9 per 1,000 impressions. And that, again, that's kind of like the average of the all platforms. Obviously, if you're a more niche industry or what you're promoting is very niche, then it will cost more. And I've seen it go up to like slightly under $20. In terms of clicks, I found that it's gotten more expensive in this year for some reason. It's around $1.50 to $2.50 per click for niche industries. And I've easily have seen that go up way more depending on how much of a challenging time you're having with kind of promoting your campaign or your event or podcast, for example. And for those link clicks, I found also that you really need to be intentional and kind of have a cap of when you're going to draw that line of, okay, that's enough money. So it's really important to kind of keep an eye on that, and also really tailoring your audience so that you can get the most bang for your buck when you're running these paid campaigns. And that brings us to another break. So if you want to pause here and take a bio break or water break or just stand up for a little bit, feel free to do that. Okay, I'm going to continue on. We have 2 more sections to go. This brings us to content creation. There are a lot of different types of content pillars. That's what they're called, like the types of content you're producing. But I've noticed for companies that are focused on branding and marketing a product or a service that's not necessarily in health will have very different content pillars. So when I looked into the blogs, when I looked into what a lot of the social media companies had to say, a lot of the things that people were writing about didn't necessarily reflect what could apply to our industry and sector. So this is just from my own experience, having worked in this area for quite a while now, that I noticed that the content pillars for us breaks down into announcements, promotional, feature, and educational. So for announcements, that can be anything like milestones, new projects, new funding announcements. For things that are promotional, it would be like events or conferences or awareness days. For features, it's featuring award winners or inspirational stories that may have kind of come up. And for educational, it's fun facts and information about the cause the organization supports and any live streams of animals in the case that you're a zoo or an aquarium, and they're quite entertaining to watch. Now, it's really important to kind of find a balance between all these different types of posts, and so that you're not only posting about one thing all the time, because that can be quite boring for a user or a follower to kind of see. Something else that I've come across is something called the 80-20 rule. And I don't know how realistically this can apply for science and health organizations. If you can get it to more so like 60-40, I would still say that's like pretty impressive. But the majority of your content should be helpful and interesting for the audience to kind of view. And the remaining like minority of your content should be focused on selling or promoting an event or service that your organization provides. In terms of posting online, it's really important to establish a consistent branding voice and tone for your social media channels. And it's totally okay to aim to be approachable when it comes to social media, because it's a far more casual platform. I recognize that not everyone will have the luxury to do this, though. So find what works best for you. Next up is also, do you have the rights or permission to use the photo or image or video when you're posting those things online? And this kind of brings us to another thing that is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, is that every single social media platform has different dimensions for their images, headers, and profile images. you really need to tailor and make sure that the dimensions of the images that you're posting online are reflective of what the platform can kind of host. And this also extends to videos and their lengths as well. When you do not account for these dimensions, you do end up with some unfortunate cropping. And I know the platforms have become more forgiving in recent years, but it's just something to keep in mind that you can end up with some unfortunate cropping. Another thing with your content creation is that you really want to create and tailor content that is that is intended for each platform. I know a lot of organizations will take the same post and post it across the board. It doesn't look great. If you're going to be posting cross-posting all the platforms, you really need to be tailoring what that post is going to look like. And something I was asked at the start of this project was whether or not I can kind of talk about how things can go viral, how we can hack the algorithm. Honestly, if I had the answer to that, I would be very rich. I am not rich, so it kind of gives you a clue as to how much I know about this. However, I can kind of talk a little bit about what tends to make things go viral. And what researchers have found is that viral content and emotions go hand in hand. Viral content has a couple common qualities, and that includes eliciting a strong emotional response. They found something that evokes positive emotion will likely go more viral than something that evokes negative emotion. The other one is that the viral content often provides relevant or practical information, or the viral content is often entertaining or surprising. So these were the common elements of viral content. But how exactly would this apply in the situation of like science communication or health communication? So I pulled two examples for you that kind of worked well within that community of the account, like the community account that was related to it. I briefly worked at the Chemical Institute of Canada after graduating, and this was a particular post that went, I guess, viral within our community. So when we're looking at viral content and we're from like the health sector or the STEM sector, what we understand viral content in, as in like a cute puppy video going viral, is going to look a little differently for our specific industry and sector. So for this tweet specifically, I drafted it with the intention of using a little bit of humor. And I was really grateful that my manager allowed me to use a little bit of humor to try to get our chemistry and our related community members to kind of get their abstracts in specifically for the conference that was coming up. And it says here, 3 reasons to submit your abstract for hashtag IUPAC 2021 before March 16th. 1, present at an international conference. 2, connect with researchers and professionals from around the world. And 3, it would make Keith very happy. Do it for Keith. For someone who is not familiar with what the CIC does and isn't part of the CIC community, will not understand point 3 at all. But because our followers all know who Keith is the conference coordinator when I was there, when we worked together. He was the one who would collect all the abstracts and kind of set those up for the conference, and he'd build the itinerary. So people understood that Keith was the person who was organizing all the abstracts and was the point contact for the conference. So a lot of people got laughs out of this because they recognized, oh yeah, Keith actually has a lot of work to do. And if I get this in on time, it might make his life a little easier and he won't be as miserable. So for this, we actually ended up getting a lot of engagements from our members and our followers. And quite a few people ended up replying, even though usually for organizational accounts, I find that unless people are angry at you, you normally don't get a lot of replies. Another great example is from Ottawa Public Health. If you want to ever look at some fantastic social media work in health communications, I strongly recommend checking out Ottawa Health. They have gone viral in the sense of it's been picked up by the news both in Canada and the US, in terms of a lot of the social media work that they do. So I highly recommend. This post was shared with me with a friend where they're like, I don't know if I really agree with that, but I've noticed that the general consensus was that a lot of people thought it was really funny. So the post says, some of the more strongly worded replies to our tweets have been encouraged us to go have intercourse with ourselves. Well, don't mind if we do, because your safest sex partner during the COVID-19 pandemic is yourself. And I thought it was very cheeky. A part of me was also kind of surprised that this got approved, but if you take a look at how Ottawa Health has kind of built that relationship with their followers, as well as the branding voice they use, it still pretty much aligns with their mission. If you haven't taken a break yet and you don't feel like powering through the last section, feel free to pause right here. We have one more section to go. And for those who are like, no, I can do this, I'm going to power through this, we're going to continue on. We're at the last section, which is social media analytics. And social media analytics is one of my favorite things. This could easily be a multi-hour course. It does take me a couple weeks to cover this in my class, but I'm going to try to do it in 15 minutes or less and kind of give you the highlights. Looking to analytics helps us determine whether our campaign was successful or not. Remember that checklist at the very start? And I highlighted that we need to ensure that we're picking the measurable metric in order to measure our success. And the reason why we do this is because so that we can report on our social media success. And there's a number of different ways we can report our success. That can be through campaign reports, which is just looking at all the posts you published in a timeline that are like grouped together. So like a campaign, just looking at the campaign posts. You can do monthly reports or quarterly reports, which are just kind of like regular overall performance reports. I tend to do monthly reports for my clients. Usually you also can do a year-end performance summary. I really recommend doing a year-end performance summary just to see how you've done over the year. And if you graph out a lot of the different metrics for the different platforms, you can look at where you have your peaks and lows, and they'll correspond with whether you did ad spend or whether you had like a major event or a very popular campaign. And if you do that enough for a couple of years, you'll be able to compare from the previous years and onward. Unfortunately, it's a little harder to go past beyond 12 months for different platforms because they just don't hold on to that data for you anymore. The other option is also to use generated reports from social media management software as well. I found that it's not nearly as accurate and I can't customize it as much. But again, if your full-time job or your full-time responsibility isn't to do social media and the analytics, totally okay to rely on that as well, because it gives you a rough idea of how things are going. Media coverage by social media and traditional platforms can also be an indicator of success. If other social media accounts have kind of retweeted it a lot, if there was a lot of traction, maybe the local news or national news picked up on it. So that often happened with Ottawa Public Health over the pandemic. And lastly, it's important to also look on the return on investment for ad spend, because that's something that I've been asked about in the past. And also we need to make sure that whether or not investing on social media in terms of ad spend is actually worth it. And one of the ways we can kind of look at that, it's a bit of an art and not a perfect science. We can definitely set up tracked links where it kind of shows you where the link was clicked, whether that was to social media or not. That you will actually end up having to pay more. So I try to guesstimate because I work with a lot of nonprofits. Usually you'll have to work with the person who is managing the event webpage, for example, or the website that we're driving traffic to. And then we'll compare the numbers of how many link clicks there were, how many people went to the website to drive traffic. Obviously, the social media link clicks aren't going to account for 100% of all the webpage traffic, but it gives you a good idea of maybe it contributed about 30% or 40%. And from there, you can be like, oh, okay, so our return on investment was X, Y, and Z. So it kind of gives you a rough idea of whether you should spend more in the future or whether you should just not spend anything at all. In terms of social media analytics, I would show you my spreadsheet, but due to confidentiality, I can't just show you the spreadsheets and data of my clients. But this is generally the spreadsheet that I would set up for everyone. So every single tab on an Excel spreadsheet, for example, will be for different platforms. And because the metric names are a little different, like for example, LinkedIn has something called reactions. They're equivalent to likes, whereas Facebook and Instagram and Twitter have likes, even if they have slightly different options to do some similar things like reacts, like Facebook, for example. So I have on the very left column metrics, so the number of posts, the impressions I want to look at, likes, link clicks, engagement rate, new followers, and total followers, just to see what the growth is like. And I'll have each month. So I only have 4 months here because I can't really fit an entire year on here. So it really depends on how you want to manage that. And then there's the total and the average. I get a lot of questions about what is a good impression rate. Typically for a single post, if you're getting 10 to 20% of your total follower count, I would say that that's actually pretty good. It's usually, we have to keep in mind, just because, for example, let's say you have 500 followers, not all 500 followers are going to be online at 12 p.m. when you put up that LinkedIn post, for example. But usually if we see around 50 to 100, which is like 10 to 20% of our follower count on LinkedIn, for example, that's actually like pretty decent performance, unless if you're putting ad spend behind that to kind of push it. I know a lot of people get a little icky about marketing and ad spend, especially in like the scientific sector, but I kind of want to take a moment and reframe that for you. Usually when we're putting money towards ads, we're paying for space to have something show up in someone's feed. We're not necessarily sending something. We're just kind of paying for that real estate on someone's feed so that it pops up. And the way that the ad algorithms and also how you've set up your audience targeting works is that you're picking people that will likely engage with what you have shared, but they just haven't happened to come across your stuff yet. So that's how I want you to kind of think of ad spend. And in terms of growth and for like new followers and such, it really depends on the organization and the account. You'll find that certain accounts will have better growth than other platforms. And that's a really good indicator that that platform is where the majority of your audience is on. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't still invest in other platforms that you really hope to grow. For engagement rate, usually the benchmark is around 1% across the board for all industries. You'll find different numbers across the board when you do a quick search. Every company, every social media website will tell you something slightly different, but I found that on average, 1% is the average across all industries. And for specifically our sector of like STEM, health, and science and research, I found that because our following count, unless if you're like a super account, aren't usually anything more than a couple hundred to a couple thousand, that you're looking at around, if you have around a 1.5 and above percentage of engagement rate, that's actually incredibly good. So that's an indication that a lot of your audience members, a lot of your followers are engaging with your post. Even if not everyone is seeing it, a large percentage of them are engaging with it, which is a good sign. So don't be too discouraged when you're like, oh, we have 500 followers, but there's only like 50 to 100 impressions per post. Like, obviously, these are just averages. Sometimes you'll have worse performance. Sometimes you'll have even better performance. And again, both of those are indicators of what's resonating with your audience as well and what is not working with them. So if you have any like severe outliers, I would take a closer look at, oh, I wonder why it performed the way that it did. Okay, so that kind of brings us to me taking you through the back end of what the social media analytics can look like. So if you do have access to your social media accounts and this is your first time taking a look at the back end of what the analytics will look like, feel free to follow along and open your account with you. You can just like hit pause here and kind of do that. So I'm going to start with Twitter. For Twitter, as I mentioned, the trending topics, it's on the side what's being talked about. So I'm actually currently staying with family right now in South Korea. So it's coming out as South Korean. Usually it comes out as Ontario for me because I'm based in Ontario. For analytics, you'll find it under More, under Creator Studio, and Analytics, and I'll open a new tab. So for RCI Science, they've graciously let me share the back end of what their analytics looks like. There are two things I want to point out. So the home will kind of give you a good summary of how each month was, and the tweets will give you a slightly more detailed breakdown. Twitter has gone through a lot of changes, or X, as we've kind of gone over this year, as Elon Musk has kind of made our lives a little difficult, our social media managers a bit difficult. And even here you can see in the warning, well, a note that says that improvements are being made. This has been up for a while now. I'm not sure when the improvements are coming, but I hope they're coming soon. I want you to know that prior to the change in ownership of Twitter, the more detailed breakdown of like tweets, tweet impressions, profile visits, mentions, and new followers was present in every single month, unless if you went around 12 months back. You'll see here it kind of cuts off after a couple months. So if you're trying to do an annual overview of how everything's going, you want to track it every single month. So a couple before the end of the following month, you want to pull all these numbers or else you're not going to have access to them. Very frustrating, but it's how we need to navigate things right now. And as I mentioned, like you can see here, RCI Science is having a bit of like a slower month. They've had like summers tend to be quieter months for a lot of organizations. I would not stress about that. Like I said, you can't be always performing incredibly high on social media. It's going to be ups and downs. So usually I pull these metrics. I pull the number of tweets, the tweet impressions, the profile visits. Again, profile visits are a great indication of like brand awareness. So people are interested in your account and they're checking your account out. Mentions, maybe if there's an event, people will tag your account while you're running it. And the new followers kind of indicates growth. So for tweets, I typically don't export data from Twitter because I find that they have a pretty good interface. So I'm going to go like in August, and they'll give you all the posts that were posts published in August. And what I like to focus on again is on the left-hand side here, engagement. So it'll give you the engagement rate, the link clicks, set like the retweets without comments. So there's two ways you can retweet things on Twitter. Retweets without comments is where you're just resharing that post as is. If you're retweeting with a comment where another user will kind of add on top of it and like post it with like your tweet within their tweet, that's not going to be counted towards your analytics. Hence why it just has retweets without comments. There's also likes, and then there's replies. Another thing about the reply section, if you have been threading a lot of posts, what'll happen is that this number will go up. That doesn't necessarily mean other users have left replies. Your threading technically counts towards replies because the way you thread things is you're technically replying to yourself. So that's how Twitter looks. If you kind of want to do like a qualitative analysis of what your top posts, like your top performing posts are, you can collect like the top 5, for example, of your top tweets. Again, this feature has not been working consistently, I've noticed in the last little while. So a little frustrating, it doesn't show up here, but usually it's going to be organized based on impressions. So that's how I would summarize Twitter. Twitter also only goes back, I believe, 12 months. So keep that in mind if you're trying to go back and trying to pull data. So I'm going to be covering Instagram and Facebook together, and that's because Facebook bought Instagram a while ago, and they've kind of combined their analytics and their business suite together. under something called Meta Business Suite. So you'll see both of them combined. When you go to the company page, you'll have to be logged in as an admin, or you'll have to be logged in as the page, and you can see a left-hand panel here, and there's something called Meta Business Suite. So when you click on that, again, it'll open another window. And here, you're going to have to do one more click where you go into insights. See, Twitter calls it analytics, Facebook and Instagram call it insights. So same thing, just slightly different terms. The overview kind of gives you an idea of like what the reach is, so how many people may have seen it. For both Facebook and Instagram, if you're only on if you're only on Facebook, Instagram won't show up. That's normal because you'll have to connect your Instagram account, unless if you have one. And for the overview, it kind of gives you a breakdown, like a broad strokes of how the performance is. It shows you how many likes, followers again. So I like to specifically focus on audience. An audience will show you the breakdown of age and gender, and for both Facebook and Instagram. It'll also show you the location. So the majority of the people are based in Toronto. And another tricky thing is that I've noticed that sometimes the graphs don't always like populate beautifully as they should, but you can navigate that by exporting the data as a CSV file. And if you decide, I really want my brand colors, and you're pretty savvy with Excel and you can make a graph, then you can absolutely do that with the CSV data. This usually doesn't change too much unless if you had like set an exponential growth over the month, but it's just nice to know and kind of track what the age groups are for all your different audiences. Unfortunately, unlike Facebook and Instagram, Twitter doesn't have any of this demographic information anymore because they got rid of it a couple of years ago. For LinkedIn, it actually is by far probably the most detailed in terms of like the business sector. The other thing here as well is there's also overview, and I found overview is just pretty self-explanatory. It just gives you an overview, but I found it doesn't quite show me and give me the nitty-gritty details that I want. So I usually stick with content. Let's give it a second. There we go. So for content, you'll see, you're like, well, Kim, that's not very easy to navigate. I totally get that. In the case of content, this is where I will export the data and work with the raw CSV file to kind of do some like data crunching. The most advanced formulas you'll use for this is like sum and average. So it's really not that bad. And you can set the timeline that you want to export your data. So if, let's say, you don't have a management software, then this is where you would do a campaign analysis. You would just go in, set in your timeline, clean up any campaign, like posts that weren't related to the campaign, and then you would do your own data crunching. So when you do click on export data, it'll give you two options of Facebook and Instagram. And on Facebook and Instagram, again, set the date. You can like set the data view of like lifetime overall posts or like daily posts, and it breaks down on like every single day of what was viewed, activity. So it's really up to you on like what you want to look at. Instagram, you'll also need to download 2 accounts, post and stories as well, and it'll give you 2 different files. I find Instagram's analytics are actually quite simple as well, compared to like Facebook when you pull the stuff. Okay, last one. So for LinkedIn, similar to Facebook, where you also have to be an admin, for LinkedIn, you also have to be an admin. But once you're an admin, you'll see the posts that kind of come up here, and you can select RCI Science. So, because they've generously added me as a super admin, there are different privileges. And right here, when you're trying to find where the analytics are, it's just on the left-hand panel. The only ones that you really need to focus on are visitors, followers, and content. Leads and competitors, I find that don't really apply, and competitors can often be not very accurate and a little confusing. So for LinkedIn, you can also set your custom dead dates. So if I want to look at August, there's 2 calendars here. So start date, I select the first date. You have to scroll down, select the second date, and then you update. And then you'll be able to export the data. But for visitors, it's anyone who's not a follower, but they were interested in your page. And that will break down into sector that they work in, industry, their level of career. So whether they're entry, mid, senior, manager, things like that, as well as like what profession they technically hold, and then as well as their location. You can also find this in your followers as well, but your followers are the folks that just follow your account. So I find that for the demographic for this one doesn't shift significantly, while for visitors, you may find a little more shifts. Both of these things will also indicate how many mobile users there are, as well as desktop users. So for example, if you have more mobile users, you want to be designing images and videos that are going to be mobile friendly so that people can actually read the font on your images. And it also kind of gives you a good overview of how many followers there are. Followers will also show you growth on how many followers you have, so you can also track that as well. And again, as I mentioned, it shows you the location demographic. And then lastly, for content, that gives you a very thorough breakdown of how many people engaged with what and how often, whether they reacted, they commented, or reposted. And that will show you a daily breakdown as well as a content focused breakdown. As I mentioned, it would take weeks to kind of go through this one by one. So I really strongly encourage you to like export and download the CSV files. For LinkedIn, you really need to do that. Twitter, you don't. For Facebook and Instagram, it's up to you. It'll be a lot easier to process everything from that standpoint. And that's a wrap. So I'm just going to summarize a couple things on like what we learned today. The first is that the majority of Canadians are on social media. So it is a very powerful tool that can be used. Different audiences are on different platforms. So it's really important to choose the platforms that best work for your goals. When planning and executing a campaign, it should align with the organization's overarching goals, and posts tend to perform best during work hours. Remember to aim for a diversity in a type of content to keep your followers engaged. And if you want to try to aim for viral content, try to evoke emotion or create an emotional connection for your followers. And lastly, use the metric that best conveys your progress and success when you're doing your analytics. Thank you sincerely if you have made it to the very end of this workshop. This workshop was created by myself, Ki-Youn Kim, in collaboration with the Royal Canadian Institute of Science. I'd also like to gratefully acknowledge that this workshop was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Pacific Institute on Pathogens, Pandemics and Society, and the BCCDC Foundation for Public Health. Now, this workshop is part of a series on social media communications. And again, I've just mentioned the organizations that have supported this initiative to allow us to be able to do this. And if you would like to access other workshops in this series, visit youtube.com/@PIPPSBC. If you have comments or questions, feel free to reach out to smbc@sfu.ca. And remember to follow them on Twitter @PIPPSBC.